Hello and welcome to another Think Design Work Smart. Thank you very much for being with us. Today, as usual, I have with me Adi. Hi, Adi.
Hello.
Before we go into the topic at hand, which will be clean code and some comments related to clean code, it's been a while since you've been with us. So what have you been doing since?
Well, many things. A lot of things to do with the current customer, changing many things in the organization from this point of agile coaching, technical coaching, architecture, and so on. Doing architectural spikes, which is maybe an interesting topic to discuss because I saw that many people don't know about it. Also working a lot on creating T-shaped teams, and with quite a big success so far, at least on the willingness to do that, and many things around this, and probably also a constant focus on retention in agile self-organized teams, which is something again not very talked about. How to take care about retention and be also responsible for your own team, not considering that in a big corporate HR will take care of this, but you'll do that inside the team and self-organize on retention as well.
Right. Well, that sounds very interesting. I had a lot of fun, more or less, with migrating some of our tools to newer tools. And it's been quite a challenge, an interesting challenge, although it has been a bit, well, it made me unhappy at certain points in time. I tweeted that, whenever you do a migration project, 10%, first 10% of the time is for doing 90% of the work. And then the rest of the 10% of the work will take another 200% of the time. So that's, and I had a lot of answers to this tweet. So it seems to have struck some reality,
It's always like that, right? If you focus on doing everything, it's going to be more and more difficult. And I guess it's a very good case of Pareto principle.
Yeah. And I think in this case, it's also related to knowledge, because whenever you are migrating to another tool, you don't know. And it's something that you've never done before. Most likely, it's something that you will never do again, most likely. So if you're doing this, it's a completely new thing. And trying to make it perfect will just make it go forever. So you have to accept that you will leave some information behind, that something will not actually quite be ported to the new tool and so on. And this negotiation is a bit difficult, but it's also difficult to figure out how to switch between the tools, how to move data between them and so on. So it's, and this is no matter how much marketing they make on how easy it is to port and so on, you'll always have more work to do than expected. It's a good surprise if you have less. All right. So the topic for today is clean code, or rather, some comments by Dan North on clean code. Now, we talked about Dan North before in the context of Solid and his proposal of Cupid over Solid.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems that now this is a rather older tweet, but I wanted to talk about it, and there haven't really been any news since. So I don't think we are behind. So this is a tweet by Dan North on 31st August. He says, okay, I took Uncle Bob on holiday with me, or rather I decided to finally read Clean Code cover to cover, and wow, I have opinions. I mean, even as a technical book reviewer, I would really struggle. A handful of gems buried amid a vast amount of content that has aged like milk. And my first reaction to this tweet has been, okay, fine, I mean, we all have opinions. I'm used to it, no problem with that. But what I expect is to have some facts, some things that are actually interesting, or concrete about clean code. And he later, being answered by some people, he said, okay, so here are a few pieces of advice that I found in this book that I don't agree with. Code is clean if and only if it is test-driven. TDD is the only way to write clean code. Code without tests is unprofessional. Equating professionalism with childish petulance. High code coverage leads to quality. Low code coverage means poor quality. And he says with no justification or explanation. So this is, let's say, the crux of what we'll be talking about, and I think there's a lot more to discuss around these things. But before we go there, I think it's important to discuss a few things. First of all, it's the persona of Robert C. Martin, also known as Uncle Bob, who has been, and I think you would agree that he has been quite, how would you say?
Opinionated?
Yeah, opinionated, and splits the world of software in two.
Yes.
I see a lot of fans of Uncle Bob. I see a lot of people who disagree with Uncle Bob fundamentally. And I think part of it is how he presents. He presents in a very, let's say, directive manner. It's like this, or...
And unilateral. It cannot be any other way.
It cannot be any other way, yeah.
I don't know if he thinks that, but certainly this is how it looks like.
Yeah. And it's not like, he never talks like, look, I have these experiences and these experiences have led me to believe that X and Y. It's always, you have to write tests. If you don't write tests, you are a bad programmer. And if you are a bad programmer, you are not moral. And that would be like a short version of his arguments.
Yeah, it's a way. I personally don't agree with this way of communicating. I think other professionals from software do things in a similar way. He's just more well known for this style. I'm not doing that. I think it's the world is way too complex to split things in two, or to split things very clearly. And I think you always need context.
Yeah. And so let me give you just a simple example. I normally would use things like dependency injection, because dependency injection, and it derives from some of the clean code rules, it derives from solid principles. Dependency injection is something that helps you have changeable design, because you can replace anything that you inject into another class, you can replace with another implementation. So this means you can test it. It also means that you can replace it with, actually change the code without changing the code. Just add new features instead of changing existing code. However, there are situations where this doesn't work. And one situation that I've encountered is when you write code for C++ code, let's say for embedded software. And there you have a limited number, you have a limited memory, limited heap, limited number of pointers that you can create, so you cannot inject as much as you'd like. And in this case, it's important, you are working within a set of constraints. Saying that it's wrong is just not correct, right?
Mm.
So where I sit with Uncle Bob is I have read the books. I think there are some key things there that we need to keep, and we'll discuss about those. But I also think that it's important to realize that he is mixing a school of thought with a school of writing code.
Mm.
Right. And I'm not in either camps. I'm not against him. I'm not for him. I can say I'm a big fan. I cannot say I'm a big against.
I think in many of his experiences and examples, you can get something to learn from. From one idea, you can learn what to do, and also you can learn what not to do. So if you look at this way of behaving, for me personally, it's a good example of how not to make a presentation, of how not to behave, and also how not to write from a certain point of view books, which are very unilateral. But there are also things to learn from, like some good practices, I think. But again, in a context.
Right.
Because clean code is very useful, I believe, for junior programmers, for people who start. If you have already a lot of experience and you stumble upon the clean code book, I think it doesn't bring that much value if you already understand principles of design and so on. But in some situation, in some context, there are good practices, I believe. So that's why I try to take the best out of everything.
Yeah. All right. So with this being said, let's talk about clean code for a little bit. And I think there's something very important to realize about clean code. Clean code starts from the idea that the way you write your code is very important, and that it influences your design. It's actually more than that, because it starts from the extreme programming idea that your code is the design. I've talked on this channel before about the two schools of thought about design in software development. The XP school of thought is mostly the code is the design. You write the code, it's like the blueprint that you pass into a factory, which in your case is a compiler that builds the product, right? There's another way of thinking about the design, which comes mostly from the patterns community, and that is the design is the structure that comes before the code, right? So clean code comes from this idea that, your code is your design. And so the way you write the code influences your design. And not only that, but it is very important for maintenance, for keeping the code changeable, keeping the code open, which in the end is very important for business reasons. I know that often you would hear Robert C. Martin talking about you have to write clean code or otherwise you're not a good programmer. So he comes with a moral argument, but there's actually a very pragmatic argument behind clean code, which is if you don't understand the code that you wrote or that a colleague wrote, it will be very hard to change. And if it's very hard to change, if it'll take longer, that will cost you. It will cost your business, because if your business change is slow, then other businesses might change faster and take over you. We are in this kind of an environment where new things tend to be important. Now, is this always the case? Not always, because I also worked with people who are building, for example, software for medical devices that use radiation.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to change that code very often,
Yes.
right? You want it to be very well written and proven that it's correct, and leave it like that. And that's why whenever you need to change code like that, 3 people need to sign off on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a good idea, because you don't want to pass a lethal dose of radiation to people undergoing, analysis in a hospital. So does it apply to everything? No, but it does apply to these situations that are most common nowadays when you write software that is meant to be changed, software that is meant to evolve, and software that is not constrained really by a lot of other factors. Because if you're writing like a web application or some kind of enterprise software, most likely you are not limited by resources, by memory, by or the limitations are so high that you don't actually care about those. So I think it's important to understand this context, and it's also important to understand that no matter what, let's say we don't agree with clean code rules, we will still need a set of rules for how to write code, right? Because code is fundamental to what we do. You cannot just say, okay, as it was the idea in the 90s, that you just draw UML diagrams and then generate all the code and it will work. We know it doesn't work like that. So you absolutely need some rules. Now, is there an alternative to clean code? There's another book written by Kent Beck, which is not as well known, and I actually don't remember the title. I will search for it. But it treats exactly the same problem, rules of writing code. So you don't have to go with clean code necessarily, or you can pick the best out of the 2 worlds. So fundamentally, something like this is absolutely needed, right? And I think you agree with that.
Yes.
Okay, so now let's talk about what then North is finding wrong with the book. So code is clean if and only if it is test-driven.
Yeah.
This is actually in the book. I remember it. It's not a rule that I take. It's a rule that I take with a grain of salt. And I'm a fan of test-driven development, right?
Yes, me too. I mean, this is quite absurd because I treat test-driven development as a tool to bear complexity. And when you have very simple things, it's not overkill, but it's not necessary.
Right.
It's really, you can test, if you test before, if you test after, it's the same thing.
Yeah. And in some cases, and
you don't test at all.
You don't test at all. I've written a script last week that I realized, look, I don't need to write tests for that. Because it was making some calls to a REST API, and I knew the REST API, and I checked the results on a smaller sample, and it looked okay, and so on. Did I follow clean code rules? Absolutely. Yes, I still follow clean code rules. And what clean code rules I followed? Well, I wanted to have names that I understood. So I figured out how to find good names. I wanted to have small methods. I wanted to have methods that do only one thing, and so on. Right?
Yes.
So to me, this is one of the examples where Robert Martin is coming with, well, after all, clean code is, let's say, his definition, right? It's his book. So he defines clean code as being test-driven.
Mm-hmm.
Now you might equate, because it's called clean code, these are common nouns and so on, but I'm going to treat clean code like something that, Robert Martin put together. And so
it's a concept, yeah.
It's a concept. So, and because he did that, he can make up whatever definition he wants about it.
Exactly.
Do we have to use that definition? Not necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So I agree on this. Definitely with the North.
Yeah, not absolutely necessary. Test-driven development is the only way to write clean code. No, it's what we discussed until now.
It's quite absurd to say that, because I saw very well written code, and I asked, how do you write it? And I say, well, we write it and then we review it, and then maybe we test parts of them, and it was good. It respected most of the ideas of clean code, with a grain of salt. And I didn't even know about clean code.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, good practice, thoroughness, being attentive to details, a good review process, skill, and you have the same result. So,
yeah, and I think it's important here to look at it also. If you're writing it's probably a problem of optimization in a way, right? Because you can write code, you can review it, then perhaps write tests later if you need to, and so on. Typically, the problem with that is that it takes longer. And I know it doesn't seem so,
yes,
but it does. Most likely it will take longer because you are building on moving sand. You don't know precisely what works and what doesn't. Whereas if you have already tests, you are always building on solid ground. And it's easier. You can go faster. You can have more trust in the code that you are building upon.
So you're more efficient, but it's also something to look on. Not every team wants to be that efficient.
Yeah.
It's something that can make them weird to, trainers, coaches, managers. Not every team wants to be efficient, and not every team needs to be that efficient. As long as they have good outcomes from the business point of view, they don't necessarily need to be that fast when delivering those outcomes.
Yeah, and it depends a lot on the context. All right. I'm gonna jump to the last ones for now and then come back to the other. High code coverage means quality, low code coverage means poor quality. So it's been a while since
maybe you're not. Yes.
It's been a while since I've read this book, but I think it's misrepresenting what's written in the book. Robert Martin is known for saying the only good target for tests is 100% coverage, but he's also saying a lot that it's an asymptotic goal. So it doesn't mean that if you have 80%, 70%, it's bad. I think that if you take this with a grain of salt, and I know well, it's a bit hard with him, but the way I interpret this is if you have more coverage, let's say the next sprint that you had this sprint, then it's good. You are progressing. You are asymptotically getting close to 100%.
But it's the same like your story with when you're moving data from one part to the other and migrating. At one moment, it doesn't become efficient anymore, and the cost is increasing so much to have results that don't matter anymore.
Yeah.
So that's why asymptotically, and I know people put figures like you need to have 60% coverage, 80% coverage, 90% coverage. But in fact, again, it's very context dependent. So if I have configuration code, should I test at 100%? I don't think it makes sense because it's configuration code, doesn't have any logic.
Yeah.
But yeah, my tool of coverage will say it has no coverage, so it will decrease the overall coverage. If my code is mostly configuration code, if I have 15%, because I don't know, I don't know what tool and I'm just configuring it in code, is it bad that I have 15% coverage? No, it's not. So you need to look on the context. Do I have logic? Do I have business logic? How complex is it? How important is it to the business? Is it part of the core logic? And so on.
Yeah, and I think here two techniques come to mind. One is automated testing strategy, where you figure out what test to write for what part of the code and what test to avoid writing and what part of code to not write tests for.
Yeah.
So this has to be well thought of because I guess one of the challenges of this industry is that we tend to be lazy and not to do all the work that we should be doing. And it's okay to not be at 100% test coverage. I'm not looking for that, but at least cover the most important parts of your software and understand what those are.
Yes, exactly. So I see too much discussion on numbers and not enough discussion on things like what's the business outcome of these tests, what is the risk that we foresee when we want to write these tests, what could be the risk if we don't write these tests compared to the cost.
Yeah.
So it's not really like that. I think it's a very unilateral point of view, saying a very developer unilateral point of view, saying that we need to have 100% code coverage, because at one moment this won't bring any more business outcomes. It's just cost.
Yeah, and this brings me to the second technique, which is risk-based testing. Figuring out which of your code areas are the most likely to introduce risks and then test those.
Yes.
All right. So this is about tests. And then there's one statement, equating professionalism with childish petulance. I find this as being judgmental from the north.
Yes, it is judgmental, definitely. I guess there is a root there, right?
Yeah, but since it's not very well explained.
Yes.
It sounds like, so I'm gonna skip this. I don't find it very interesting. And the last one is code without tests is unprofessional.
Mm-hmm.
Now I like to go back when we discuss this to the idea of having some principles. So we have these rules of clean code, but these rules of clean code don't come from nothing. They come from within a context. The context is writing a certain style of applications. And I think Robert Martin has not done a very good job of separating this context. This is one thing I could definitely hold against him. But on the other hand, these are like 90+% of the applications that we are building today. So maybe it's not so important. But what's important to understand is that whenever you create a set of rules, they are based on certain axioms. There's never a complete logical system that starts from a logical point of view and then goes forward, defines a set of rules. And Uncle Bob's take on programming in general is we need to be responsible as developers. We need to be responsible towards, our business, and we need to do the best work that we can in order to help this business. Now, this is a moral stance, right? It's a principle that stands behind this. Now he comes forward and he says, okay, so for me, this stance equates with test-driven development, with clean code, with solid principles, with a certain attitude of a developer that he details in Clean Coder. And this is fundamentally, it's a school of software development.
Exactly.
And I'm equating this with a school of design. So if you think about design in other disciplines, there's modern furniture design that's very simplistic, minimalistic, straight lines, very functional, very things that tend to be very as small as possible so that they don't occupy as much space. Is this a good design style? Maybe.
It depends again on the context.
Is this better than the Baroque style, which had very, flourishes all over the place and a lot of things, sculpted in wood, and you see all kinds of flowers on your furniture and things like that? Not necessarily. I mean, so what I want to say is Robert C. Martin, with his goods and bads, has created a school for software developers.
Mm-hmm.
And that school has developed later into software craft. And a lot of people are following, not as many as we would hope perhaps, but a lot of people are following this. Can there be other schools? Absolutely. But there is none other defined.
Well, I guess there are, not that well defined, but they are defined from the other schools of thought, from extreme programming, right? So if there are these people who are following more the extreme programming ways and going through ideas that, I don't know, Ken Beck or Ward Cunningham proposed, which are not that well structured. I mean, there's no book, there isn't a manifesto for those schools of design. And for sure there isn't, at least to my knowledge, another school of design that well formulated, expressed as this one with clean code. Also, you could look at from design patterns point of view. I think that's something else. It's not necessarily a school of design, but it's a way of designing things, looking at everything like patterns.
Yeah, I think if you go from domain-driven design, patterns, community, some of the things go actually against these principles.
Exactly. So you could look at domain-driven design and the Gang of Four book on design patterns. Some of these things will clash with what Clean Code is saying. And again, let's take the best of these depending on the context. So I think there are other ways, but that you cannot say that you can say I saw people saying I'm a clean coder, but nobody says I'm a DDDer or a patternist. I don't know.
A plopper.
Yes, a plopper. Nobody says that, right? But it doesn't mean that they don't have certain principles in mind when they write code or when they think about their architecture and so on.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to understand that these opinionated schools are actually very good,
Yes,
are a very good thing for the whole industry. Because if you're just kind of, let's make ends meet, I'll write some code today, whatever, if it works, and so on, that's the laziest way out, right? And now I can pick one of these and I can be for some things or be against some of the things.
mm-hmm.
I mean, one of my criticisms for clean code is that it's limited to a certain domain. One of my criticisms for domain-driven design is that it can lead to how do you call overhead and big design upfront.
Yes, too much complexity sometimes.
Right. So none of these are perfect, and we should get used with this idea. None of these are perfect.
And even if you go like very deep into the idea of, okay, we need to write TDD, it's, if not, the code police will come to us and give us a fine or arrest us. Then even like that, you need to go in detail, because there are a few schools. There's the school saying that you need to start with stubs, and there's the school saying that you're using more mocks, and there's the school saying that you can use more of the two. So even this saying TDD is the only way to write clean code, this is extremely opinionated, because I know that, for example, Robert C. Martin uses a more classicist approach, so a approach with a lot of mocks. So then what do? You need to write TDD only in this way? Or are you forced, or are you, So you can go into very, very much detail like that. And again, these schools of writing TDD make sense in certain domains, like clean code makes sense in a certain domain.
Right.
So context is important.
Yeah, there's an emerging school of end-to-end testing.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have microservices which are small enough, you can just test them end-to-end and it's perfectly fine. You don't have any problems with that.
Yes, we talk more and more, and I'm happy about that we talk more and more about API contracts and contract tests, together with microservice architecture and the ideas from domain-driven design, and these are more or less like what we were talking on unit testing on a class level, and how design the public interface of a class. But now we talk about public contracts of the API. So you see, things tend to move towards something else. So now, again, if you have clean code, so does this apply to microservices, which are really small? You could rewrite them. If you have tests, black box tests, do you care about the code there? How clean it is?
Yeah. Good question.
So, yeah, it's interesting to look from how things move and where we're heading to.
And another thing that I noticed, so for example, one of the things that is in clean code, but that's also in extreme programming, it's about removing duplication.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you think about what would make you, let's say you are a new developer in a large code base, how do you learn the patterns in that code so that you can you can utilize them effectively and without mistakes? Well, you learn through repetition. And repetition is awfully close to duplication.
Mm-hmm.
So when we studied usable software design, and one idea of this was learnability, how fast can you get into a code base, it resulted that if you have repeatable patterns in your code, you can actually get faster in the code to become productive and to become a better, to avoid mistakes, to avoid common errors.
So there's no perfect way. You always need to balance things and to make sure that you look at pros and cons and you choose one of the ways.
Yeah.
If you want to optimize the learnability or discoverability, then you need more duplication.
Yeah.
If you want to optimize performance, you probably you cannot care about readability.
Well, more or less, yes.
Or less, yes,
You care
especially on
less.
embedded or C++ systems. So it's always like that. I mean, these unilateral points of view don't make sense in some areas and do make sense in other areas.
Yeah. But I think in the end, I still find the clean code rules extremely valuable because it is a set of rules. It's there. We can critique them. We can. But what I would like to see is that people use them before they critique them.
Yeah.
And adapt them to your context. I think that some things like naming things properly, this is valuable almost no matter what you are doing, unless you are writing code that you are throwing away the next day or so. But if you write any type of code that you need to go back or your colleagues need to go back at some point, you'd better figure out naming. Small methods, again, can help a lot with changeability, with readability. So all of these things are actually very, very important in the right context. But I guess where I have something against or where I would praise Uncle Bob is that he's right about something. There's not enough responsibility in software development. At least that's my perception. I think as programmers, we need to be more responsible of what we are writing and more careful with the code that we write and so on. And I know there are constraints, there are time deadlines, there's knowledge, and you can always do it better if you've never done it before. And obviously, yes, but the responsibility should be there, right? And this is where I agree with this school of thought, which is, we are responsible for our results, and let's not blame managers and other people when we come short.
Of course, blaming is the easiest way you can do. Even like that, we cannot tackle everything, but still try to get the best out of it and try to create the best we can within the given circumstances and constraints.
All right, so I think we are getting to a close to it. Anything else that you'd like to say to close?
Yeah, I learned a few months ago about a very interesting concept that is more philosophical or about more, but I think it relates to this. And because we said that this is a school of thought. And I learned about this historian, sociologist, Thomas Kuhn, who introduced the concept of a paradigm. And the paradigm is basically the set of axioms that we use when we define a belief or a school. But I think he studied this from the point of view, in politics or in social, in society. And I think it relates really well here, because if we see that two groups or two people don't agree, we need to look at the axioms that they are expressing. And if we start from very different axioms, it's very obvious that they won't agree on something else. So you need to go very deep into this analysis and really get to the basics of where are we starting from. And I guess this is why some schools of thought, schools of programming, schools of design, schools of architecture will never agree one with another. And you can see the same in politics, or that it's opposite. So when you, and why? Because maybe they want to optimize different things, which is fine. But when we critique a certain school, it's important to look where they're coming from and which are the axioms they are starting from. And this is why clean code has certain axioms that they start from. These axioms come from, more like web programming, some systems that are extremely big, some around architectures that are easy to comprehend, like three-tier or architecture. I think that's where it's coming from. But when you go to big system, huge system, microservice architectures, distributed systems, and so on, these are different axioms. So then I guess the school of design, starting from these axioms, starts having different needs, and so different principles starting from these axioms. So this is an exercise I found very useful. So I would encourage our listeners to think about the axioms that any programmer, tester, architect, business person, business analyst, I don't know, whoever comes up, and then think if you have the same basic idea starting from, or if not, it's fine to disagree, but at least you know why you disagree. It's just a difference of views.
Yeah, and this relates to, I guess, the last statement from Daniel North, which is all of these are stated with no justification or explanation, because there is no justification or explanation. These are the axioms, right?
Exactly. So that's the idea. An axiom doesn't need justification.
Yeah.
That's where you're starting from. So.
And I'm really looking forward, and I hope he will do that and figure out other axioms and derive from those other ways of, other rules and so on. I'd love to see that alternative school of thought, because once again, we only have, maybe two schools, although domain-driven design is still not yet that structured, that clear, I feel like. But it has potential, right? And once it will touch the rules of writing code and the rules of structuring code into larger patterns and how to define your patterns and so on, and how to evolve your code and how to test your code, that's when it starts to become more at the same level, right? So there's still a lot of work to do there, I feel.
Yes.
Although if you are knowledgeable in domain-driven design and you disagree, I'd like to learn from you. So let us know. All right. So it's time to end. Thank you, Adi, for joining.
Thank you as well.
And for a very interesting conversation. I hope you found this interesting. Thank you so much for the view. And until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart.